By the end of the evening, the NFL was dealing with something considerably more hazardous than a defeat on the field, despite its claims that it was merely a preseason game. It all began with a single choice. Shedeur Sanders, a rookie quarterback, was benched by the Browns. Possibly the most talked-about football player. Not only did viewership decline, it completely vanished. Just a few weeks prior, millions of people were glued to their TVs. Now, network executives were texting in shock due to the disastrous lows. Are these figures accurate? This cannot be taking place. Fan devotion gave way to rage in the hours that followed. Sponsors were terrified. Emergency meetings were called inside league offices. According to reports, Roger Goodell canceled his weekend. And this is how one enraged executive put it. The Browns are endangering not just themselves but the league as a whole. However, how did it spiral so quickly? Is this much power truly worth one rookie? More significantly, what would happen if the Browns didn't make the necessary corrections right away? This isn't only about a quarterback, so don't make any mistakes. It has to do with control. It has to do with football's future. And it all boils down to one straightforward reality. Sanders is essential to the NFL. Additionally, what transpired after they benched him might have permanently altered the league. Everything appeared flawless just 2 weeks before the catastrophe. A game versus the Panthers drew 4.5 million spectators, and the Browns were enjoying a surge of preseason excitement. Huge for a pointless August match. The sponsors were overjoyed. The league had high hopes. Cleveland games were circled by the network for prime time. And one name is the primary cause. Sanders, Shedeur Sanders. Everyone was buzzing about the rookie sensation. Football's future. Already selling out jerseys, controlling highlight reels, and attracting a younger, more recent international audience to the sport. He was more than a performer. What happened next was so incredible because he was a magnet. He was benched by coach Kevin Stefanski. The reasoning, evolution, response, and total ratings disaster. The Browns vs. Eagles game barely reached 200,000 viewers, as opposed to another game with millions of viewers. It was a huge nosedive, not even a tiny dip. Executives at CBS headquarters silently gazed at real-time dashboards. Is this a glitch? A senior executive reportedly texted. It wasn't. Reality struck quickly and forcefully. Every rating point in the NFL is worth millions of dollars in advertising. When broadcasters started doing the math, they were not pleased with the results. One of the greatest falls in preseason viewership ever occurred within a single night due to Sanders' absence. And the networks weren't the only ones suffering. Sponsors began to withdraw from their scheduled appearances. The feasibility of supporting Browns games in the future was questioned by advertising partners. People weren't merely horrified by what was taking place on the inside. They were shocked that nobody had anticipated it. Everyone believed they knew how the NFL operated. It turns out that they were unaware of Sanders' true appeal. Additionally, something other than numbers began to shatter as the game progressed. The supporters weren't merely paying attention. They were getting ready for battle. The TV screen was not the end of the crash. It quickly spilled over into real life. The energy shift inside First Energy Stadium happened instantly. Sanders' fireworks were anticipated by the crowd. Rather, his name was absent from the starting lineup. And the building's air was drawn out in a matter of minutes. Instead of only complaining, people stood up and walked away. Before halftime, entire rows were vacated. Attendants in the parking lot observed fans leaving mid-aim. Another observation was made by security personnel. There were no longer any concession lines. Sales of beer fell. The merchandise is abandoned. Browns ownership had had enough by the third quarter. According to sources, owner Jimmy Haslam was glued to his phone in his private room, replying to a barrage of irate messages from NFL owners, corporate sponsors, and league officials. "We're watching the value of this franchise fall by the minute," someone reportedly said during an emergency conference call. However, nobody was ready for the next storm. The spectators did not simply walk out of the stadium. They accessed the internet. Two hashtags, #FreeHater and #BoycottBrowns, exploded within 10 minutes of Sanders' formal benching. Tens of millions of impressions and millions of posts. Videos of supporters setting jerseys on fire in the parking lot went viral. Like protest flyers, season ticket holders shared cancellation notices on social media. If Sanders didn't start in Week 1, some supporters even threatened to boycott the entire season. The group had set off an uncontrollable event. A nationwide fan uprising rather than an issue or even a scandal. For all the wrong reasons, the Browns became the most talked-about football team. One choice, one benching, and one rookie who wasn't even on the field were at the heart of it all. However, this was more than just a Cleveland crisis for the league. Because after that, football's business side began to fall apart. This was more than simply an angry moment by Sunday morning. It was a national movement. Nothing else could be covered by sports programs. The headline was the same across all networks. NFL fans are incensed that Sanders was benched by the Browns. The former players were furious. On live television, Stephen A. Smith erupted, calling it the worst coaching choice of the decade. "You've just committed franchise malpractice," observed Skip Biss, laughing. Additionally, the fans were already doing more than just chatting while commentators discussed if this would result in Stefanski losing his job. They were planning gatherings to burn jerseys. There have been widespread cancellations of season tickets, open letters from local fan clubs, and public threats to stop Sanders. User flare tags on Reddit were modified to boycott mode. In actual life, ardent supporters mailed protest envelopes containing their ripped tickets. Some decades-old Brown supporter chapters began dissolving suddenly. However, Cleveland was not the end of the seismic wave. Everyone in the football world was suddenly aware of something horrifying, which caused it to explode. The fans didn't hesitate to unleash their power. "No Shedeur, no viewers" was the simple message of one viral post that received over 2.8 million views. It's that easy. The attacks weren't limited to the internet. Social media employees at the Browns facilities were told to halt posts that weren't absolutely necessary. Why? Every comment section had become very antagonistic. Every video was full with opportunities to let him play, and every post was ratioed. A digital siege resulted from the online uprising. Behind the scenes, NFL executives at the top levels were starting to freak out since this wasn't limited to a single player, market, or preseason error. This was a direct threat to the league's authority over the management, marketing, and monetization of stars, and it was existential. And the NFL would have to pay millions for the next blow. Before it was a sport, the NFL was a business. Additionally, warnings sound quickly when companies lose money. Those alarms were overwhelming by Monday morning. According to reports, Nike used Sanders as the focal point of a whole new marketing campaign, was the focal point of commercial concepts that State Farm had shot. Pepsi was getting ready for tie-ins at the national level. Everything. One presumption, that Shedeur Sanders would actually play, was the basis for millions of dollars in branding, advertising, and packaging. That investment lost all of its value when he was benched. Marketing representatives were enraged behind the scenes. It was summed up by a prominent agency insider. "Wins and losses are not relevant here. This has to do with ROI. Your asset is not benched." And the avalanche continued to expand. When rookie betting records were being broken by DraftKings prop bets that were especially linked to Sanders. They were betting on the Browns. They were betting on him. Fantasy points, throwing yards, and touchdowns. And the volume plummeted when he failed to take the field. The world of fantasy football was also affected. In DFS lineups and season-long leagues, Sanders had emerged as a must-draft rookie. Then, all of a sudden, nothing. No production, no points, and no incentive to watch. The following week, a significant fantasy site recorded a 67% decline in Browns player selection overall. Sanders' seating was more than simply a letdown. League sponsors were aware that it was a disastrous financial mistake. Some of the NFL's largest partners reportedly started calling Park Avenue directly to demand answers, according to internal sources. They were reviewing the contingency clauses. Fallback advertising efforts were taken off the shelf. This was no longer a PR fire. The economic situation was severe. The most terrifying aspect was that it all came down to a single choice: every lost cash, every bet that was cancelled, and every endorsement that was dropped. Sanders, bench. The league promotes enthusiasm. The excitement was Sanders. There were plans for non-foot brands to capitalize on his popular appeal. Sanders was a player who could increase the pie, something the NFL seldom gets. After that, he disappeared off the screen. The benching was not understood by fans abroad. "If he's the best player, why isn't he playing?" inquired European fans on forums. The Browns were not being questioned. They were challenging the league system as a whole. Panic reached its peak at that point. Executives discovered that Sanders' aura was being used to facilitate the NFL's international development, whether they were aware of it or not. One preseason benching had become a global marketing disaster. Back home, ticket sales plummeted, sponsors withdrew, stadium vendors reduced their operations, and entire Browns-driven promotions were abruptly terminated. However, nobody seemed to really understand the implications within the Cleveland facility. Even non-foot brands intended to capitalize on his widespread appeal. Sanders was a player who could increase the pie, something the NFL seldom gets. After that, he disappeared off the screen. The benching was not understood by fans abroad. In forums, fans from Europe questioned whether he was the best player and why he wasn't playing. The Browns were not being questioned. The entire league system was under scrutiny. Panic peaked at the point. Executives became aware that Sanders' aura was, whether intentionally or not, directing the NFL's global expansion. An international marketing disaster had resulted from one preseason benching, and in the meantime, ticket sales plummeted at home. Sponsors withdrew. Stadium vendors reduced their activities. Campaigns spearheaded by Browns were abruptly halted. However, nobody seemed to really understand the stakes inside the Cleveland plant. The marketing team was instructed to continue promoting team culture, according to sources. However, jerseys are not sold by culture. 15-year-olds in Germany don't care about Cleveland because of culture. Sanders did. The NFL did not simply make a calculation error. They see firsthand how one choice completely changed their future. The most astounding thing is that they were aware that this was feasible. They observed the figures. They sensed the excitement. Additionally, they continue to allow a coach to conceal a developing occurrence. Players, coaches, and staff come next. They revolted rather than merely disagreeing. The Browns were dealing with more than just a fan uprising behind the scenes. They had to deal with an internal uprising. Tension was like a knife within team meetings. Because empty stadiums affected everyone, veteran players who had supported Stefanski's meritocracy approach for years began to change their minds. Deals for endorsements dry up. The locker room is designated as radioactive, and prime-time games vanish. During a private meeting, a veteran allegedly claimed, "I didn't sign here to play in front of ghosts." The message was unambiguous. Sanders wasn't the only person Stefanski was harming, he was endangering the careers of everyone else. Ownership, meanwhile, had had enough. According to reports, Jimmy Haslam called Stefanski and general manager Andrew Berry for an explosive sit-down. Terms like organizational suicide, franchisee-defining error, and most plainly, fix this immediately. However, the harm was getting worse. There was conflict among the assistant coaches. In 1995, there were rumors that keeping Sanders on the bench was similar to coaching. Others suggested that the staff was being torn apart by philosophical differences. An offensive assistant stated, "We're playing chess while the NFL plays Netflix," in a conversation that was leaked. It wasn't just the players who were furious. Marketing directors, employees, and trainers were all furious. Why were they putting in extra time for preseason games that had no real significance? Everybody sensed it. The organization was on the verge of collapse due to obstinacy rather than an error. And while the home burnt all around him, Stefanski, a coach clinging to process, was at the center of the storm. However, there was one factor that no one could manage. Sanders' reply. He maintained his professionalism. No social media insults or public tantrums. However, people close to the quarterback claim that the frustration was growing. Because you can tell you're losing the locker room when your own teammates, trainers, and assistants begin to show signs of weakness. Subsequently, the situation worsened beyond anyone's expectations. The NFL as a whole was now in danger due to what began in Cleveland. Confusion gave way to widespread panic inside league headquarters. According to reports, Roger Goodell canceled his weekend plans. TV executives and marketing directors were scheduled for emergency meetings. The problem was no longer isolated. There was more than just a decline in viewership. It was crumbling. The most terrifying aspect was that it had nothing to do with the Browns. Because everyone was interested in the Sanders narrative, regardless of whether they were Bengals, Packers, or ardent Cowboys supporters. Not only the player, but the principal as well. Who's safe next if someone like Sanders might be benched in spite of popular desire, stats, and hype? The league's executives began posing difficult queries that nobody wanted to hear. What if lineups are now determined by fans? What happens if players become more loyal than teams? What if the stars of the future walk? It wasn't merely conjecture. League partners were aware that this was unsustainable. 8-figure revenue losses were predicted by rating curves if Sanders remained on the bench. TV partners weren't silent either.